Hello. Christmas is just 4 days away. But for some people, the big day is today, the shortest day of the year, which is the date of the winter solstice. This festival, a day when the sun reaches its lowest point in the sky, has been celebrated for millennia. So from where do we get our Christmas traditions? Are they more pagan than Christian in origin? And does it matter? Joining me to discuss the origins of our Yuletide traditions are J.J.Middleway, a celebrant and ritualist based in the Druid tradition, the Rev'd Steve Hollinghurst, a Church of England priest and author of New Age Paganism and Christian Mission, and Ron Hutton, Professor of History at Bristol University. J.J., what does this festive season mean to you?
Essentially, for me, it's about honouring the rebirth of the sun. So, in context, the sun has gone on a long journey southwards over the last few months, and it's at its lowest point, its furthest away. We celebrate the sun standing still on this day and its rebirth when we can see it in a few days' time.
And Steve, what does it mean to you?
Well, as a Christian, it's about another sun in another sense, to do the pun, I'm afraid, the birth of Jesus Christ. Now, I don't think it happened this time of year, but it's a good time to celebrate it, actually, in the midst of winter, the light of the world coming into the darkness.
And Ronald, what does it mean to you?
It means the solstice, which nowadays, having scientific instruments, we can say is on a particular date. But until recently, it's that magical time when the sun appears for a few days to rise and set at the same points in the horizon. And so much religious wonder has been woven around it.
I want to look in the first half of this programme to where we get these pagan Yuletide traditions. How far back do you think we can trace the winter festival, JJ?
I think if we look at our ancient monuments, Stonehenge is aligned with the winter solstice sunset. Maze Howe up in the Orkney is also of that persuasion. So we go back to our ancient ancestors thousands of years ago who recognised and honoured the sun.
Ronald, is it anything more than a desire for a period of celebration in the midst of winter gloom?
Well, in a sense, no. In a sense, yes. In a sense, no, because celebrating the middle of winter gloom is such a huge human need that so much spins off from that. But from that need to celebrate greenery, light, hope, you find that any great human desire for linkage with the divine, linkage with other humans, linkage with the planet, plays in and gets woven into the mix.
Steve?
Of course, we've got to remember we're thinking in a very northern hemisphere sphere now. You know, those poor Australians who are out on Bondi Beach on Christmas Day, it's clearly not a midwinter festival for them doing Christmas. But they would have had, in their own traditions, southern hemisphere midwinter, because it is something we need to engage with. And we're there in the dark, we light our fires, we tell our stories, and we need to celebrate and feast.
The winter festival that I'm most familiar with, Ronald, is the Saturnalia, which was a Roman festival. Just tell me a little bit about what that was about.
It's the best recorded one in ancient times. It begins on the 17th of December, ends on the 23rd, and the ancient Romans all stopped work. They ate prodigiously, drank prodigiously, played lots of silly party games, and appointed the humblest member of the household to be its leader. It's a time of innocent sport and conviviality.
JJ?
I think what's interesting about that, it was a time of reversal. So those roles were reversed, and what they point to is the reversal of the sun's journey and a time of change and of transitions, and that's through the whole Christmas period and into New Year as well.
Ronald, we associate these Yuletide traditions with Nordic customs. Tell me a little bit about that. You've mentioned greenery. What else is involved?
As far as we can tell, because we know less than we do about the Romans further north, it's about three great things. It's about merrymaking in the midst of winter, it's about charity to those who can't afford to make merry without help, and it's about misrule, the role reversal to which J.J. referred.
I can associate the others with Christianity, Steve, but the misrule bit, that's a bit tricky.
Well, I mean, the interesting thing of being that, of course, medieval Christian countries often had the Lord of Misrule elected in the middle of Christmas or New Year, so the custom kind of continued. But you could put a Christian slant on it, very much as the idea of Jesus is actually a very subversive figure, one who comes to upset the powers. One of the pieces of Christian liturgy that's very much associated with the birth of Jesus is the Magnificat, the Song of Mary, which is all about how the humble shall be laid low and the low raised up. So one can do quite a bit with a theme of misrule, actually.
Do you buy into that, Ronald?
Oh, completely. There are specific Christian customs of misrule, like the boy bishop taking the place of the real bishop in cathedrals. Happens at Hereford, not too far away from me. And the Feast of Fools, and the lesser clergy took over the greater churches from the greater clergy.
JJ?
If we look at it, what happens today? I mean, office parties, kissing under the mistletoe. I mean, there's a degree, there's quite an element of misrule. And people coming together as a family, it's as often as not, it spurns argument as it does love and harmony, doesn't it?
To get back to the Nordic tradition, Ronald, it's very much associated with one of the Norse gods, Odin.
Yes, as a god who rides through the winter darkness with his retinue.
Just tell me a little bit about that. It's associated with the story of the Wild Hunt.
Yeah, the idea of the Wild Hunt is an invention of the great German folklorist Jacob Grimm, as in Grimm's fairy tales in the 1830s. And what he did was to mix together a whole lot of different traditions, that of Odin, that of Frau Percht in Austria, Frau Holler in Germany. The idea of retinues of spirits revelling through the winter skies, and sometimes their voices are heard in the storm and sometimes in those of the wild geese.
And they have a ghostly leader, and he's got a 8-legged horse.
Well, he's got a ghostly 8-legged horse in particular bits of Norway. Elsewhere, it's a woman who leads, sometimes a man who's very unlike Odin. He's kind of jolly and friendly. So different leaders in different places, but the idea of the midwinter cavalcade in the sky is universal.
But I'm interested in that figure who can sometimes be a bit sinister and can sometimes be friendly, the resident Steve with Santa Claus, with Father Christmas.
Well, he's going to find out if you're naughty or nice, you know, and reward you or punish you accordingly.
And he's got an 8-legged horse, which corresponds to 8 reindeer.
I mean, these things come around. That's the reality of it.
But in the Nordic tradition, there is this sinister side to it, JJ.
Well, there is. I mean, but Odin is riding with his warrior band through the heavens. And, with some stories, it's 8 reindeer or 8-legged horse Sligo or something like that. And he's supposedly got a long white beard, very much like Santa. So the reindeer are the clue. This Nordic sort of link there to our Christmas tradition.
Yes, you can... Ronald?
Can we sort this Odin Santa thing before it goes too far? It's a modern convergence. Santa with his reindeer appear overnight, literally in 1822, when a genius called Clement Clark Moore in New York, which is nowhere near Odinsville, happens to write a poem in which the medieval bishop, St. Nicholas, is turned into a spirit of the northern night, riding in a sleigh drawn by reindeer and coming down a chimney with presents for children on Christmas Eve. This is a totally new vision of Santa Claus.
What is interesting, and you alluded to the darker aspects, I mean, there is this figure, Frau Holler, who's associated with holly, and also with the hag aspect of winter, much like also in Scotland and in the Gaelic countries, the Cailleach. That's very much of this land, the Cailleach. And that is a dark winter hag, a time of decline and everything dying. But Frau Holler is also an embodiment of the female aspect in the land, in nature. I mean, you only have to look at holly, the outrageous green in the middle of winter, fertility, there's life to be had. And
interesting, you've brought some holly and mistletoe into the studio with us. Why is that, JJ?
Well, they're very meaningful. Just in the last few days, I've been with 200 people, actually, as it happened, celebrating mistletoe, celebrating what that means as a sign of fertility in this time.
Well, let me remind you that you're listening to Beyond Belief, and today we're talking about Yuletide traditions. Many of their elements have their roots in our pagan past. The Christian Church took them over and gave them a Christian significance. But in an increasingly secularised society, as the resonance of the Christmas story loses its significance, is it the pagan elements which we continue to celebrate? Does that mean that paganism is on the rise in modern Britain? And is it time for an upfront rapprochement between Christianity and paganism? And with me are Ronald Hutton, Steve Hollinghurst and J.J.Middleway. Leila and Phil Lagarde are pagans. Between them they have 3 children, which means that at this time of year they have to negotiate a tricky path between remaining true to their own beliefs while satisfying their children's ambitions to share in the same joyful Christmas celebrations as their friends and schoolmates. I asked Leila what it was that attracted her first to paganism.
I've always really had a sort of inclination towards sort of nature and the outdoors and wanting to be a part of that.
So that's the sort of pagan you describe yourself as, not a Druid or a Wiccan?
No, I wouldn't like to attach any kind of label to my beliefs like that. And I don't follow any kind of doctrine that anybody else has prescribed. It's all kind of my own path and my own beliefs that I've come to.
But Phil, do you attend any pagan rituals?
We often attend the rituals that the Leodis Circle put on.
What's that?
It's a sort of rather informal group, I suppose, of pagans based around West Yorkshire.
Yeah, it's mostly very open rituals that I think anyone from any kind of faith would get something from, and sometimes it's sort of a formal ritual at a stone circle, and sometimes it's just a meet up in a pub and there's a talk and people socialise and have drinks.
To be specific about Yule, what will you be doing for Yuletide this year?
We usually have some kind of pilgrimage to a local place that's special to us. So there's a sort of Celto-Romano god carving in the local woods, and we often go to visit there and make a libation, or we go to a special stone with a cup and ring marking on a hill and with the children and spend some time there.
What about Christmas? Do you celebrate Christmas?
Sort of, I suppose we do. Yeah, we definitely... the school has a Christmas carol singing concert, and I love singing carols personally, so we go to that. On Christmas Day we have the children open their presents then. You know, we open ours on the solstice, but the children open their presents on Christmas Day, so we don't do anything that's explicitly Christian, but we celebrate it with the family.
Does the Christmas story play any part in the way that you celebrate Christmas?
No, I don't think so.
No, I wouldn't. You know, I think when we, say, went to the Yule party, there was, for example, a sort of ritual involving the symbolism of the sun returning. You know, this idea of a sun god or something being reborn is very much like the kind of symbolism you could connect with the Christmas story. Mm-hmm. So in some ways, these things can be quite complementary to one another, and they're, you know, of course, Christianity and paganism are both very long-standing parts of our heritage.
But
yeah.
what do you make of the Christmas story, Phil?
I think the interesting thing is it's never been a particularly powerful story for me personally, as much as, say, the simplicity of, you know, the pagan myths and so on. But I wouldn't discount it or express any kind of particular dislike for it. Personally, you know, I feel that it is a particular expression of a sort of mystery, you know, the mystery of the relationship between divinity and man.
Sounds a bit like you're being careful not to offend.
Perhaps I'm quite an inoffensive person.
What do your friends and family think of your pagan views?
I think generally they're very accepting. I mean, we do seem to have quite a lot of pagan friends, and Phil's parents, they're not religious as such, so they don't, you know, they're happy for us to kind of pursue our own spiritual paths.
Do you think there's still a stigma attached to being a pagan in Britain today?
To a certain degree, yes. I do think there is a slight antagonism towards paganism, and this belief that people are up to no good if you're kind of interested in magic and the occult and pagan beliefs.
Because when you try to find out what the numbers of pagans are in Britain today, it ranges widely from about 40,000 into up to 300,000. Do you think there are pagans out there who are scared of outing themselves, so they're sort of surreptitious pagans?
I think it's possibly more that, you know, a lot of people may identify as pagans without particularly taking part in any particular sort of pagan community, because I think a lot of what, you know, leads people to identify themselves with that kind of label is the kind of experiential nature or having some experience happen to them that makes them associate themselves with that label. How do you then differentiate between that sort of maligned category of spiritual but not religious, or identifying as pagan and things?
That was Layla and Phil Lagarde. Steve, what did you make of that?
I think it's very reflective of a lot of what's going on in contemporary Britain. I mean, the way they negotiate the Christian element and the non-Christian. I'm quite convinced that paganism is growing as hard as the numbers are to identify. And so that kind of thing is more common for people, I think, these days.
Is the way they celebrate sort of typical of the way that you celebrate, JJ?
I could identify with much that I heard there with Layla and Phil. I too don't like labels. Celebrating nature and the abundance and rebirth. And so I could really equate with just about all of it, actually.
Ronald, quite clearly there are parallels. There are lots of things that the Christian church has appropriated from the pagan tradition. But when did the church actually officially adopt the winter festival?
The earliest sign of it at what's now Christmas is in 354, which is over 300 years after the death of Christ. If Christ was born when shepherds watched their flocks by night, he was probably spring or autumn in the Holy Land. And it was celebrated in May or September until the 4th century. But what Christianity did brilliantly was lob Christmas eventually into a gap between two Roman festivals, Saturnalia, which celebrated the solstice in its beginning, and the New Year, which was where the year began a week later when the sun was clearly coming back. And Christmas Day is on the day when the sun starts to move again to the naked eye after the solstice. So it's a great position to occupy.
And there's always been a difference in approach between the churches of the East and West, Steve, when it came to celebrating the major festivals of the Christian year.
I mean, partly that's due to history of calendar differences and the calendar changing under Pope Gregory, so we have the different dates now. But there are different emphases, too, within their traditions. So within the churches of the East, there's a whole series of festivals that happen over Christmas and Epiphany, which are strongly representative of ideas of a recovering of the Garden of Eden and all sorts of things like that, which actually a lot of which are not present in the Western Church.
But it's very interesting that in the East, the emphasis is on Easter and the resurrection. In the West, colder climate, the need to have a festival in the middle of the winter, it's Christmas that's the big festival.
I think that's interesting. I mean, I think that's partly also the way our culture's gone, because in a sense, Christmas, with all the presents and the feasting, has had that emphasis, which I think has lasted. Easter was a very big festival in the medieval world, but of course it's less conducive to a more secular society, I think, in some ways.
I want to look at some of the traditions, our favourite traditions around Christmas. Now, I think it was Layla who mentioned she loves to sing carols. And lots of those ancient traditions were Christianised. And I've always been puzzled by the words of the holly and the ivy, for instance. That must have been originally a pagan song.
Almost certainly. I mean, we've got our holly and mistletoe sitting here in front of us as we talk about it, and you've got that, but then it's Christianized, and this is the thing that goes on. So it becomes the blood becomes of Christ becomes like the berries, and the thorns, the prick of the crown of thorns, and there's also a thing of holly and ivy being male and female, so it's Mary and Jesus. Now it's a total Christianization of something that almost certainly has roots before that. But I think the thing I would want to emphasise here is what's going on and why. And my understanding would be that early Christians valued a lot of these nature celebrations and incorporated them into Christianity. And as Ronald says, it's a great time to have a festival in winter that talks about the light of the world coming into the darkness. So the imagery just lends itself brilliantly to this Christian reinterpretation of the customs.
Ronald?
I'm not a Christian, never have been, never will be, but I seem to be very benevolent towards Christianity this afternoon. I think it's actually a genuinely Christian hymn making use of visual symbolism, because we know from accounts that the churches across the land were decked out in holly and ivy for Christmas every single year. Now, in doing this, they were taking on a pagan custom of decorating temples and halls with greenery at midwinter. So what you have here is a truly ancient custom, but a stunning visual symbol right in front of the church congregation's eyes when this hymn is being composed, which is about 300 years ago.
Holly, ivy, but not mistletoe. Now, you've got mistletoe in front of you, JJ, but why was there not mistletoe in churches? What was the suspicion about mistletoe?
Mistletoe is associated too much possibly with sexuality, which the church has a hang-up about, but certainly fertility and rebirth. I mean, it hangs in between the worlds, neither heaven nor earth. It doesn't sit easily. Holly and ivy are slightly more innocuous. Mistletoe is very potent.
Would you have mistletoe in your church, Steve?
Oh, that's an interesting question. I would have no problem with doing so, I think, is the answer. But I think actually that's because it's been so totally secularised and it's become about human romance. So, these symbols get reinterpreted and they lose their meanings for us and become something else.
During the Middle Ages, the church became less accommodating towards pagan elements at Christmas. The Reformation, for instance, and certainly during the Civil War, the time of the Commonwealth in England, when the Puritans banned it, Ronald.
Oh, yeah, because they reckoned that Christmas was both Roman Catholic and pagan in origin, so two definite no-nos. It was banned effectively from churches, but people kept on celebrating. Parliament met on Christmas Day in 1656, the height of the Cromwellian era, and the MPs present noted how many of their number were mysteriously missing, and the fact they'd all been kept up awake all night by people celebrating a legally non-existent festival. 1660, it's all back.
Steve?
I think there's a whole interesting thing here between Christianity and its historic relationship with paganism that all this highlights. Where I would be coming from is that actually the adoption of pagan festivals by Christianity is part of a rooting of Christianity in its local context, and Christianity has always been, at its best, highly contextual. But there's a whole other tradition that says this is all a mistake. And that actually you can't let these pagan elements into your Christian faith. You've got to keep it pure. And the Puritans represent that. And you don't celebrate Christmas at all because it's really pagan.
JJ?
I think what's really interesting is the Scots don't celebrate Christmas so much. They celebrate New Year, Hogmanay. And it was through that suppression that came about. There is a need to celebrate something. And it re-emerged in a different form. And in this midwinter period, Yuletide, call it what you will, we need to come together and celebrate.
It was really during the Victorian era that the modern Christmas, I think, was invented. I think of Dickens and the Christmas Carol, sentimentalising of Christmas, if you like. That was the big moment, Ronald, wasn't it?
Certainly was. Christmas almost died out around 1800 when it ceased to be a public holiday in most of England. And it was brought back because of a need to celebrate the new middle-class family identity. And it was perfect for that, and Dickens absolutely caught the spirit of it.
It does raise the question, though, Steve, what was the Christian content in the Victorian Christmas?
Well, very little in some ways. I mean, I think that the celebration of the Victorian family sums it up very well, actually, as Ronald just put it. I mean, of course, the Christian stuff is there, but you're in a society, I think, that as it modernises, does not know what to do with its more mythical elements. And I think that's been very much the trend was set by the Victorians, and that carried on into the early part of the 20th century, where Christians were busy demythologising faith and cutting out all of the mystery and these kind of things. I think we're now into a reverse period, actually, where those kind of things are starting to come into significance again, and we're wanting back those kind of elements.
JJ?
What's interesting to me is the Victorians reintroduced to this country what was still prevalent on the European continent. The need for ritual, the need for symbolism is strong in all of us.
I'm just interested that given the Church's traditional hostility to paganism, it's been very ineffective in wiping it out, Steve.
Well, that's assuming it wanted to wipe it out. I think the hostility grows over time. So my understanding would be if you look at early figures like St. Paul or Justin Martyr, they actually saw a lot of positives in the paganism of their day. So Justin Martyr talks about the Greek philosophers as schoolmasters for Christ. And the idea is quite likely that the early Celtic church, again, saw the same in whatever Druidry it encountered, that these were not things you fought, but things you actually brought within the faith. And that's why we have the pagan customs in there. But as time went on, it became more hostile. So a very good seasonal story would be the legend of St. Boniface, who was a Saxon missionary into Frisia, modern-day sort of Belgium, Holland, around there. And his mission method seemed to be to find sacred sites and chop them down. So the famous story is that he finds an oak sacred to Donar, it's probably a version of Odin. He chops it down and it splits in two and becomes a cross, and the locals are all wowed by the power of Christianity. But the interesting thing is that from the stump grows up what is alleged to be the first Christmas tree. And that's going right back into sort of about the 7th, 8th century, that hagiography.
How much hostility still attaches to being a pagan in our modern society, JJ?
There is a degree of it. It's certainly shifting. People are more inclined to come out. I have friends in the police, in the Ministry of Defence, in the BBC, in all walks. It has been uncomfortable at times and still is on occasion. But there is a shift going on.
To me, People like Steve are not the problem, and Steve's church is not the problem. The groups who are of most difficulty to modern pagans are a very unholy alliance of a few evangelical Christians, often recent converts and in very extreme sects, of people who hate novelty and hate change and see pagans as exotic and fearsome, and those who just don't like religion and don't want any new forms or revived forms appearing. Back in 2000, Stonehenge was opened up to the public at midsummer for the first time in 1.5 decades. I went along in the middle of the night to have a look, and I dropped my car at a service station a few miles off and walked with a Druid friend down the A303 to the stones. Partly for convenience, partly because it was a chilly night, my friend put on his Druid robes, and from every fifth car that passed us on the A303, somebody shouted abuse or threw something at him. Now that's a litmus test of what the public was like in 2000. I don't think a lot has changed.
Steve?
I think there's a real issue here, and I understand the kind of groups that Ronald's identified. There is a whole thing of ignorance here, and whatever one's opinions, ignorance is no virtue. And so there is a need for people to understand paganism and I think accept it as part of today's society. I think the other thing that comes in here is the whole agenda of Christianity as a missionary faith. And for me, that's part of why it adopted early pagan customs in early Christianity, because actually that was a way of being missionary, to actually make something that was a home in its context. Now, that either can be viewed as, I think I would, as actually acknowledging good things in that context, or it can be seen as a sort of a form of misappropriation. And that kind of tension is there. And I think we have to face that and deal with it honestly.
Well, we're about to break up for the season. So as a final question, JJ, just tell us how you will be celebrating this season.
Well, I'll be celebrating it at different levels with different people. So I celebrate the solstice with fellow pagans, if you want to call them that. At the same time, I'll be getting together with my family and celebrating community and family. Here in the embers of December, as the veil between the years grows thin, rejoice that we are all together, as days will soon draw out while we draw in.
Steve?
Well, I will be going to church. It'll be midnight mass, no doubt. That's probably my favourite service. I think it's really magical. I love the carols and the whole imagery. We will enjoy a really good turkey lunch and sit round a fire, and we'll have trees and greenery and holly and all of that decking the house.
And Ronald, what about you?
I'll celebrate with a variety of different religious groups on consecutive nights and then retire to my family to make merry.
Well, that's all for this week. My thanks to J.J.Middleway, Ronald Hutton and Steve Hollinghurst. I'll be back at the same time next week. Until then, have a wonderful festive season, however you choose to celebrate it.